gaming reviews done quick. It all depends on your skill. Go for broke, and welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm Octrinity, your host, and having defeated Shenlong, I might stand a chance. This time, we're running down Street Fighter. Contrary to popular belief, Street Fighter isn't the first fighting game out there, but it's certainly got the ball rolling. This game is essentially a martial arts tournament with many of the characters' fighting styles based loosely on real martial arts. The game has long established a control scheme consisting of 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons, and a set of special move motions that have been used in countless other fighting games, and for that matter, non-fighting games. The game also has a lively tournament scene, having been included in several international fighting game tournaments as far back as the 1990s. Street Fighter tends to get frequent, incremental updates, with only major system changes getting a new number or title. So for this episode, I'll run through a late entry in each of the major releases. Altogether, I'm running down 9 games this episode. Sound good? Then round 1, fight! A reminder for you guys, not every series starts out good. Here's a rare game where all I really have to do is show off a few video clips that make it look stiff and boring, which it is, but I've still got a minute to fill, so... This game features 12 characters in total, but Ryu and Ken are the only ones who get to play as. The rest are fought in sequence, and it's clear they wanted to just make each of them cheaper and more difficult than the last without any regard to balance. Special moves do exist, but they're extremely hard to pull off, and as they weren't intended to be well known, they're ridiculously unbalanced. Throws and combos, however, are apparently too advanced a feature for this game. Probably worst out of all these is that the game just feels sluggish. Characters seem to just hop from side to side as if there's only certain points on the screen they can stop. Attacks feel extremely slow, and sometimes the game just doesn't react to me pressing anything. I suppose a fan of the series would be interested in playing this just to see how things got started, and to see how fighting games as a whole have, but they certainly won't enjoy playing it. As for everybody else, you can just ignore this game and consider this series to have really started at Street Fighter 2. And here we get to the game that defined fighting games so well that any explanation of it I could give is probably going to sound generic. I mean, the idea of having multiple playable characters, each with a unique style and different strengths and weaknesses, was basically invented by this game, as was having console games nearly identical to their arcade counterparts. By the end of the run, we had 17 characters, each with 3 or 4 special moves apiece, plus a super move that required the meter at the bottom to be full, but was essentially a more powerful version of your character's most well-known move. And surprisingly, there's not an obvious favorite in terms of who's the best or worst character. Combos are here as a sort of accidental invention, so you won't see large combo strength the more modern fighting games have accustomed us to. Years after its release, this one doesn't have the same flashiness as more modern games, nor does it have quite as many gameplay options as its successors. But in the end, yes, the sequels have improved pretty significantly, and yet I'm still giving this game a good score because, in spite of its age, simply put, it's still a fun game to play. Street Fighter Alpha, so named because it takes place sometime between the first 2 games, brings back most of the previous cast, including a few from Street Fighter 1, and introduces a lot of fun new characters, and though some are more fun than others, nearly all feel like welcome additions. This one also starts taking the storyline a lot more seriously. In addition to selecting your character, you're also selecting a fighting style. One scales the moveset back to Street Fighter 2 but increases strength, one provides multiple super moves that can be unleashed at different power levels, and includes more common actions like air blocking and quick recovery, and one replaces super moves with a shadow double that duplicates your movement, one that a skillful player could use to string together some insane combos. The variety is appreciated, and certain styles seem to fit certain characters better, but it does feel like it's close to an indication of skill level than anything else, with high-level play gravitating more towards V-ism and away from X-ism. Overall, though, this is a step up from the last game, with constant action and characters with more abilities than last time. When this game was new, it got a bit of a bad rep over the character selection. By the end, we had 20 characters, exactly 4 of which were taken from a previous game, plus a couple that play nearly identical, though on that topic, a couple of these characters feel like they ended up in the wrong game, perhaps. A few more familiar faces would have been nice, as with a little more balancing on the characters, but let's be real, this was never a bad game, and I think the general public has vindicated this one since many of its new features and some of its new characters made it into a sequel. Among the new features that made it were EX moves, slightly enhanced versions of special moves that consume a small portion of the super meter, and having to choose your super move. Before the match begins, you'll pick one of 3 and stick with it. Among the features that did not make it later on were a parry system, which allowed you to completely and quickly avoid any hit if you tap forward with frame-perfect timing. I prefer this one over the last few games, primarily because it feels much more fast-paced and fluid, and characters feel a lot more mobile. It's a technical game, but it's also a great one. Street Fighter EX, no relation to the EX moves described last game, is the series' first attempt at 3D, except the 3D part is pretty much for display purposes only, since movement's still limited to 2 dimensions. Of particular note here is that it's not a one-on-one fight. The game can be played 3 different ways, either as a Marvel vs. Capcom style tag match, a King of Fighters style team match, or the dramatic battle where you control multiple characters at the same time. Dramatic battle feels more like a novelty, though the other 2 are pretty cool. But the main game feels like it's more of a prototype of the later Street Fighter 4, complete with a handful of features that feel like they were fleshed out later. If anything, it feels closest to Street Fighter Alpha with a few new features and different characters that we're unfortunately not likely to see elsewhere in this series, except not quite as fast-paced. Also, it feels like some of the returning characters weren't recreated quite as well here, with some of them missing some well-known moves. It's for the most part a pretty good game, but it's not a particularly memorable one either. Ever play a sequel to a long-running series and think to yourself that knew exactly what worked and what didn't from the last few games? Well, this is one of those games. Super and EX moves return along with Ultra moves, which get stronger based on how much damage you've taken, though you're choosing one of 2 before the fight. We've got 3D graphics but strictly 2D gameplay. The surprise blow from EX is retooled into the focus attack, a chargeable attack which can absorb a hit and stun your opponent if charged enough. The roster size is huge, up to 39 characters, which includes the entire cast of Street Fighter 2 and most of Alpha, and the new characters feel right at home with the others, which still introduce unique styles, and while character tiers do exist, they're spread so thinly that pretty much everyone is tournament viable. Perhaps best of all, it seems approachable to everyone, with the game easy enough to understand for beginners but with enough depth to keep experts interested. This game seemed to cause a resurgence of the fighting game market, and it's easy to tell why, as more than 4 years later, it's my pick for the best fighting game currently on the market. Crossovers between 2 different series can be pretty hard to pull off and appeal to both of their fan bases. To this game's credit, pretty much all of the characters you would expect to show up are here, as well as quite a few you wouldn't. But I'm a bit more ambivalent about how the Tekken characters were transferred over, which feels like the designers couldn't decide if they wanted a straight conversion or completely re-envision them as if they were Street Fighter characters all along. This game is a tag match, with victory decided by defeating either of your opponent's characters, similar to Tekken Tag Tournament, and several other Tekken mainstays like air juggling and an emphasis on combos requiring a very specific button sequence and timing appear too. Though it feels like a bit too much of a rehash of Street Fighter 4, considering the Street Fighter characters appearing in both games are about 95% identical when it runs on the same engine. The attempt at character customization using gems to provide a bonus to your character on certain conditions sounds great on paper, but doesn't do much in practice. Treating this as a crossover, it does really well, but as a complete game it's good, but has room for improvement. But since I brought up crossover, let's also talk about Super Gem Fighter, possibly known as Pocket Fighter. It's a crossover with another of Capcom's own fighting games, Darkstalkers, but plays more like a simplified version of those games as it's a 3-button setup and a lot of the combos are literally just matching the punch and kick buttons. Hitting your enemy also releases gems which can power up your special moves, and that's a pretty cool idea really, but there ends up being some matches that will feel like they're decided primarily by who gets more gems first. Admittedly, I also question Capcom's logic with the characters they've included, since about half of them are Shoto clones, very similar moveset. It seems fairly obvious this wasn't intended as a serious game. It's mostly fan service and self-parody, or perhaps trying to market the game towards beginners or younger kids, and it fits that goal well enough, but even then it feels like one of those games that you'll play a few times and enjoy, but then put back in the box and never touch again. But since I'm bringing up that crossover, let's also talk about Super Puzzle Fighter, which uses a lot of the same visuals. And as the title may suggest, this one's a puzzle game loosely related to Dr. Mario spun into a versus format. Your characters taunting and fighting each other are for display purposes only. You'll drop your blocks into the playing field, but dropping a power sphere on the same color block will detonate all of the same color touching it and drop some garbage blocks into your opponent's field. Garbage blocks will eventually turn into regular blocks and fall into a pattern determined by your character, but it does make for an interesting and somewhat negative result that your strategy feels more dictated by your opponent's character than your own. It's a game that puts heavy emphasis on organization, quick thinking, and raw finger speed, probably in that order, but it still gets the feel it's trying to convey right. It's fast, it's frantic, it's fun, it's easy to learn, and it has more depth than it looks. Definitely not the tough-game fighting game fans will expect to like, but if you and your friends are looking for something different, this will suit you well. And that's all for now. And of course there are some games I missed here. One major release I didn't talk about was the Capcom vs. SNK series, which is a crossover with King of Fighters, the series I'd point to for being closest to this one and still going strong. Though to be fair, a lot of fighting games from the early to mid-90s had strong resemblance to Street Fighter 2. Another crossover with lots of Street Fighter characters is the Marvel vs. Capcom series, which is different and numerous enough that I'll talk about it in more detail in a later episode. Street Fighter tends to have completely new installments several years apart, but I wouldn't expect a Street Fighter 5 anytime soon. But Street Fighter 4 is still receiving new content, out later this year as Ultra Street Fighter 4, featuring new characters among other smaller tweaks. Also in the works is Tekken Cross Street Fighter, a second crossover with Tekken designed by Namco that will more closely resemble the Tekken games. If you're interested in playing some of these, most of the older ones are available as a digital download, some of which have online play the original versions lacked, and if you're okay with going back a generation, there's also some collections on the PS2.
Check back soon for the next episode of 1 Minute... Whoa, who are you?
Skullomania.
What, from Street Fighter EX? Doesn't he usually wear a suit?
Yeah, well, today's my day off.
Okay, well, why are you here in the first place? I already reviewed your game.
Yeah, you only showed me for a brief moment, you showed me getting my ass kicked.
I'm sorry, that's the video footage I had.
Well, I'm here to give you new footage.
Not yet!